Currently, we have a so-called a boom of tourism here. However, is it something temporary, or Uzbekistan is building something sustainable for the future, for the long term?
I think Uzbekistan is building.
She has advised governments, worked with the World Bank, written acclaimed guidebooks, and spent nearly 2 decades championing Central Asia on the global stage. Sophie Ibbotson has become one of the most recognizable international voices for Uzbekistan. But how did the British scholar become one of the country's most passionate advocates?
Assalamu alaikum, dear guests. Today we are in the presence of Uzbekistan's passionate global ambassador, voice of Central Asia, promoter of the Great Silk Road, the author of the sophisticated travel guidebooks, and also the world's most persuasive propagandist of Uzbek pilaf and its overall cuisine, Ms. Sophie Ibbotson.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today.
Thank you very much for accepting our invitation, despite your extremely busy week in Samarkand during the Eco Week. Thank you so much. Now, to begin, I wanted to ask, being a representative of the whole country for different fields, and also being an entrepreneur, being a scholar at the Oxford University, being a consultant for global companies, how would you describe yourself to the people who have never heard of you before?
I think my mother would joke that I have a short attention span. I like to do 100 things, because if I had to do one thing every day, go to the same office, do the same job, I would become bored very, very quickly. But what I would say is that I am passionate about the things that I do, and usually there is an overlap, a theme. It is not that I pick things out of the sky completely at randomly. So I have been passionate about Central Asia for about 20 years.
Yep.
And I have been coming to Uzbekistan for much of that time. So I first came to Uzbekistan in 2010. And so now many of the things that I do are connected with Uzbekistan and with Central Asia. Now, sometimes that's tourism, developing tourism, writing guidebooks, bringing journalists here. Sometimes it's about ecology and water security, both my work with the Committee for Ecology and Climate Change, but also my research at Oxford University, that is about the Amudarya. The book that I'm writing at the moment is also about the Amudarya. It's called Oxus, after the historical name of the river. And the things that I am interested in reading, talking about, learning about, are often connected with Uzbekistan as well. So I am passionate about contemporary art from Uzbekistan, about textiles and other handicrafts, about history, and all of these things, fortunately for me, come together in Uzbekistan.
Wow, that's great. Please tell me how your journey actually started, because what was it about Uzbekistan that actually captured your attention so that you dedicated so much time, so much of your life promoting this country?
So my first journey to Central Asia was actually, in some ways, an accident. So when I was at university, I studied Oriental languages, but I focused on the Indian subcontinent. So I studied Hindi and I studied Urdu because I wanted to become a diplomat. I wanted to work for the British government and become an ambassador. But when I was at university, before I left, with some friends, we had an idea that we would get some auto rickshaws, the three-wheeled taxis, and drive them from India back to London. And as it happened, that journey brought me through Central Asia, and I got snowed in Kyrgyzstan. And rather than trying to drive across Kazakhstan in the winter on a three-wheeled motorbike with no doors, I thought it would be more sensible to stay in Bishkek for a little while. But that was the first opportunity for me to spend an extended period in Central Asia and to start learning about the region. And the opportunities came up for me to come to Uzbekistan as well. So I was working with an NGO. I came to Uzbekistan. I fell in love with Samarkand. I fell in love with Tashkent. And then my publisher, the British guidebook company Brat, said to me, "Oh, we don't have a guidebook to Uzbekistan yet. We have a guidebook to Turkmenistan, to Kyrgyzstan, to Kazakhstan, but no book on Uzbekistan." And so, of course, I jumped at the opportunity to research and write that book. And that was about 15 years ago now. But it meant that I could travel to every part of Uzbekistan, from Fergana Valley to Surkhandarya to Karakalpakstan, and I completely fell in love with the country.
Have you had an experience in Uzbekistan which changed in some ways your perspective on life?
I think probably the place and the experiences which changed my perspective most are working in Karakal, Pakistan. So a couple of years ago, I was asked to become the tourism advisor to the chairman of the Kirish, the Supreme Council in Karakal, Pakistan. And I did that for 1 year. And for the first time, I was seeing every day the impact of the climate crisis, because it is more severe in Karakal, Pakistan than almost anywhere else on the planet. And it's, yes, the Aral Sea is a big part of that, but also changing patterns of rain, temperatures, sand and dust storms, and so on and so forth. So seeing that firsthand made me think much more about the sort of work that I want to do, the sort of challenges we face, and even within tourism, that there is a need to move away from mass market tourism, which often has a big environmental footprint, and to focus more on responsible tourism, niche products which are going to have high value, high economic impact, but with a smaller carbon footprint.
I see. We'll talk in details about the ecological issues later on. But before that, could you please tell me, you've been here for almost 2 decades now, and actually, have you had, what is the moment which you'll never forget in the whole of Central Asia?
I think actually one of the moments I'll never forget was on my first trip, and I was in Samarkand, and I was at the Registan, and this would have been in 2010, so it was when there were very few foreign tourists. I also came in, I think, June, so it would have been very hot as well. And not only did we almost have the Registan to ourselves, but I was allowed to climb up on the minaret at the right side of the Ulugh Madrasa, and rightfully, they don't let many people do that now because it's not very safe. But I was with my friend Bryn, and we climbed all the way up to the minaret. We climbed out on the top, and we were able to sit on the roof of the minaret looking out all across Samarkand. And I felt like a bird, because I could just see for miles in every direction. And it felt very special to connect with the past, to connect with the architecture, and to have that experience.
Awesome. That's great. Now, many people know what a political ambassador is. However, being a tourism ambassador is actually something extraordinary. So how does someone become an ambassador for the whole country? Like, is there some special selection process?
I don't think there is a formal process. So a tourism ambassador, or an ecology ambassador as I am now, is a form of brand ambassador. And often companies will have a brand ambassador, whether it is an influencer or a celebrity. But this was at the invitation of the government of Uzbekistan. And I became tourism ambassador in 2019 at the invitation of the Embassy of Uzbekistan in the UK. And the tourism committee then had decided that they wanted to have ambassadors to rep Uzbekistan in different countries. And they had invited film stars, directors, fashion designers, celebrities like this. And I had a very good working relationship with the Uzbek embassy in the UK, and they said to me, who do you think we should ask to be an ambassador? And so we were coming up with lists of ideas, maybe this TV presenter, maybe this person. And in the end they said, well, you know about tourism.
Do it yourself.
You work very hard for Uzbekistan, so why don't you become the ambassador? And that was a huge privilege for me, because it has enabled me to talk about Uzbekistan on a much bigger stage. I was also awarded the Tourism Fidoyasi Medal a couple of years later for my work as tourism ambassador. So the 6 or 7 years that I spent as tourism ambassador was an unforgettable experience for me, an opportunity to learn a lot more about the country, and I felt very privileged to be able to represent Uzbekistan abroad.
I see. What does actually a tourism ambassador do? Could you please tell us about the responsibilities which come with the role?
So my job as tourism ambassador was quite different to the others, because as I mentioned, the other tourism ambassadors were all celebrities. So they had an existing international profile and lots of fans who they could just talk to. But I'm just an ordinary person. I do not have a celebrity lifestyle. But what I do have is nearly 2 decades of working in tourism and a very good understanding of both the public and the private sector and how they work together in tourism development in different countries. So half of my role was really as an advisor to the Tourism Committee, and then it later became the Tourism Ministry. So to work with my colleagues there, thinking about certain aspects of strategy, including in marketing, including in product development, and then externally to represent Uzbekistan at international events, including things like the World Travel Market, which is one of the world's biggest trade shows. I worked a lot with tour operators, both in Uzbekistan and abroad, to connect them to each other, but also to build capacity and help them with their marketing. And one of the most interesting parts of my job was working with the travel media. So I had the opportunity to pitch stories and write stories myself for publications, including National Geographic Traveller, but I also organised a lot of the press strips. So if journalists had got a question about Uzbekistan or they wanted to visit the country and see it for themselves, often they would come to me and then I would help organise their trip. And so I was able to organise, for example, when Amisoy, the ski resort, opened, I organised a big international press trip then, and we had some of the best publications in the world. We had Lonely Planet, we had The Telegraph, we had the Financial Times, we had the Evening Standard, Metro, I think some of the skiing and specialist sports magazines. So huge numbers of people really wanting to tell that story. And I was able to link the journalists who previously might not even have heard of Uzbekistan and certainly wouldn't have realised that there was a winter sports industry here with the opportunity to come. And that continued all the way through my time as tourism ambassador. So the last press trip I organised was in March this year, just before I finished my term. And it was for the Times newspaper, one of the most oldest and most famous newspapers in the UK. And I was able to bring a journalist here to write about the opening of the Centre for Islamic Civilization. So that was a very special moment as well, because I got to see it as it opened with this journalist, and the two of us were absolutely in awe at the very, very impressive museum that has been built.
Yes. We have some questions regarding the Islamic Center of Islamic Civilization in Tashkent in a moment. However, before that, you know, around 10 years ago, when we were students and we visited Europe, in most of the countries, whenever we said Uzbekistan, people had some strange ideas. There were so many misconceptions, so many you know, stereotypes, like people thinking that we are extremely backward society, people still riding donkeys and camels, like that is a warlike condition and so on. Now in 2026, has the overall perspective and overall the perception changed, especially in the English-speaking world?
Certainly the perception of Uzbekistan has started to change. The first thing that we did is, because there was I think if we go back 10 years ago, most people outside of Uzbekistan just knew nothing about the country.
Exactly.
It wasn't even that they had a good view or a bad view, they just knew nothing at all. So when we started with the tourism promotion, the first thing we talked about is the Silk Road. And we said to everybody, Uzbekistan is the heart of the Silk Road. Because even if they know nothing about Uzbekistan, they have this idea in their mind of the Silk Road. They know about Marco Polo. They have the idea of the mosques and the madrasas and the palaces and the bazaars and the camels going through the desert. So they have this very romantic fairy tale idea. So we started with this message: Uzbekistan is the heart of the Silk Road, because it is activating in their memory these stories that they read as a child. Of course, that is partly true about Uzbekistan, but it is only a very tiny amount of what the country is today. And so over the past few years, we have been able to build on that, particularly as more and more journalists have come and started to write about the country, and more tourists have come, because they have seen Uzbekistan for themselves, both the historic country and the modern country, and they have gone back and said to their friends, Uzbekistan is not how I expected it to be. Tashkent is a modern city. Everything is so clean. Everywhere is so safe. The people are so friendly. So all of these messages started coming through, not only from the tourists themselves, but also from the tour operators who are selling tours here, and from the media. And when people have a good cultural experience, when they have a good experience of hospitality and of tourism, then they start thinking about other areas of the country. And I think it's very important that when President Mirziyoyev came to power, he said he had two priorities. One was foreign investment, and the other is tourism, because in some ways they are two sides of the same coin. Yes. And certainly we have seen in London, for example, former state-owned enterprises from Uzbekistan going to IPO in London and the funds being listed in London, because there is now that connection financially and in the investment world as well as culturally. And they know that if they list a good company on the London Stock Exchange, that there will be a good response from the investors. And partly that has been driven by the cultural engagement and the tourism engagement which has come before. Politically, I think there is less awareness of what happens in Uzbekistan than awareness of culture and tourism, and increasingly of the economy. But that is something which is starting to come through too, and particularly because Uzbekistan has hosted a number of big international events in the last few years. The UN Tourism General Assembly, UNESCO General Assembly, SCO Summit, big events for the EBRD and Asian Development Bank. All of those things start increasing the visibility of Uzbekistan on the international stage for people who are looking at diplomacy, multilateral relations, security, and so on and so forth.
There are so many countries which are famous tourism destinations, and in most of the cases, actually, it's thanks to the geographical position which they have, especially the beaches. The beaches, according to some, make a destination a repeated place for tourism. However, Uzbekistan has totally different tourism model, so to say. So, what do you think? Like, currently we have a so-called a boom of tourism here. However, is it something temporary, or Uzbekistan is building something sustainable for the future, for the long term?
I think Uzbekistan is building a long-term tourism sector. It is not building a beach tourism sector, but that is fine. Yes, the beach tourism market, sun, sea and surf, as we call it, is very popular, and particularly for families. But there are a lot of people around the world who would never go on that kind of vacation. So my family, for example, my parents, my partner and I, my brother and his partner, that is not a holiday that would interest us. And the other thing to think about is beach tourism often is very low value. People don't spend a lot of money because they are just lying on the sun, on the sand, in the sunshine, or swimming in the sea. So the actual economic impact for the local community is relatively small. Uzbekistan is fortunate because it has and can further develop a very broad range of higher value tourism products. So understandably, Uzbekistan started with its cultural and history tourism, because that is the easiest thing to develop here. You already have the fantastic monuments, the ancient history, a rich, intangible cultural heritage, the modern culture, and all of those things are readily available for tourism. But, and that attracts a higher spending kind of tourists in its own right. But there are also many new products which are just starting to be developed and can be expanded much further. We already spoke a little bit about the winter sports tourism, which is very good because it brings tourists in the low season when they're not doing the cultural tours, and it also brings them to different destinations. So you cannot go skiing in Samarkand or in Bukhara, but instead you can go to the Chimkan Mountains, you can go to Zamin, and so on and so forth. I think the active and adventure tourism sector is something which can grow significantly within Uzbekistan, because you have a very broad range of different ecosystems, environments that people would want to explore. There are opportunities, of course, for hiking, mountain biking, horse riding, rafting, camping, wildlife watching, all of these sorts of activities, and even the more specialist activities like caving, climbing, stargazing, geology tours. All of these things are possible within Uzbekistan. So I don't think we have to worry about the tourism growth being a short-term boom, because all of these products are not yet fully developed. They are just at a very beginning stage, and over the next 10 or 20 years we can see them grow significantly. One of the important things will be for the Tourism Committee to introduce careful tourism standards, particularly for adventure tourism, that will protect the environment, but also ensure the health and safety and the proper training and delivery of those activities, because the risks involved with adventure tourism are higher than for the cultural tours. But certainly that is something that Uzbekistan can do relatively easily. There are good international examples that we can learn from. And there are also international organisations like the Adventure Travel Trade Association who would help Uzbekistan develop world-class standards, which we can then implement and do the training so that the quality of adventure tourism in the country is very, very high.
I see. Actually, yeah, indeed, we have so much potential. We have so many incredible destinations. We have the UNESCO heritage site, Hiva, the city of Hiva. We have the whole of Fergana Valley, which is the birthplace of so many crafts. And among all the areas which we have, what do you think is one place which deserve more international attention?
I would say that Secundaria deserves far more attention than it gets. Generally, I only lead one tour group in Uzbekistan each year, and I always start their tour in Secundaria, because not only it is a very beautiful place, but you also have some of the most ancient history in Uzbekistan. And if you are going to understand Uzbekistan today, if you're going to understand the golden age of Islam in Central Asia, and why Islam and Islamic cultural heritage developed differently in Uzbekistan to, for example, in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt, you have to understand the context of what is here before. And Secundaria is a good place to learn that, because you can see the cities built by Alexander the Great, and you learn about the Greco-Bactrian Empire. You can visit the Buddhist
temples,
monasteries of Fayez-Tepe and Karatepe, and that way you learn about the cultural exchange along the Silk Road with the Indian subcontinent. And you can also learn about some of the shamanist and pagan traditions which have been preserved in places like Baysun, because all of these things were here before Islam arrived, and Islam then absorbed many of those ideas and rituals, which makes it look and be practiced quite different to how a more orthodox form of Islam is practiced elsewhere.
Yeah, actually, yes, indeed. We have so many examples of pieces of identity of previous religions. We have Zoroastrianism, we have different types of paganism, we have Buddhism and so on. And actually, even nowadays, even though after the coming of Islam, the majority of the population started to follow it, and actually they stopped to believe in those things because most of them were superstitious beliefs. However, they remained part of the overall traditional identity, and we can see them even nowadays in different traditional attires, in different ornaments, in the ceramics, and so many.
I think there are two examples that I would share. One is if you go to Fayez-Tepe and you look at the layout of the monastery, you can see very clearly that the concept of a community of religious scholars studying and living together, and the way that their monastery was structured, is very similar to the madrasas that came later. You have your open central courtyard, you have your rooms arranged around the edge for living and for studying, you have your place of worship. The actual architectural and functional design of the building is exactly the same. Similarly, I took my colleagues earlier this week to the Shahi Zinda in Samarkand, and if you go to the very, very top at the site on the back wall, you have the Zoroastrian symbol, which is a bit like a figure of eight symbol, the little turquoise tiles embedded in the wall. And you see those particularly in Khwarezm as well, because that was the stronghold of Zoroastrianism. But it is a symbol which predates Islam by possibly 1,000 years or more, but is still in use in the Islamic architecture because the significance of the motif was recognized by people, and even if they were superstitious, this is something that they kept using even to the present day.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Big part of the Islamic culture is actually a synergy between all the different representatives of different faiths.
Yes, and Zoroastrianism was the world's first monotheistic faith, so the first faith where there was only one God. So whether we are talking about Islam, about Judaism, about Christianity, they are all drawing upon some of the concepts of Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, indeed. Within Islam, we believe that the message was always the same. From the very beginning, it was to worship one creator. And indeed, we can see some remnants of that in different phases. Even though with time, they changed a little bit. So different religions, they became polytheist and so on. However, yes, we believe that that was the main concept, and the message was always the same from the very beginning. Now, please tell me, you talked about the place, the Surkhandara region, which deserve much more attention. Could you please tell me a place which, on the other hand, deserves more investment by both the government and also the private sector?
There are many places in Uzbekistan which need more investment. I think Karakalpakstan is one of them, because there is a huge amount of tourism value and cultural value there. We often hear about the investment into the environmental issues, into the gas mining, so on and so forth. But I would say, for example, the Khwarezm fortresses, many of which are more than 2,000 years old, they need investment to conserve the ancient sites and to protect them for future generations. And they need protecting against many things. One is the climate change, because with changes in the weather patterns, they are more likely to deteriorate. But also, as more and more people come to visit, whether they're local tourists, whether they're international tourists, these sites are quite fragile.
Yes.
And unless we conserve the structures, and unless we put in a small amount of infrastructure, for example, marked paths and staff to protect the sites, then we will find that people are climbing on the walls, they are taking pieces of stone, they are writing their names on the walls. And so we need to invest in the management and protection of sites like this, so that they are safe for another 1,000 years for people to enjoy. And there are sites like that all over Uzbekistan. I mentioned the Khwarezm fortresses because there are so many of them in Karakalpakstan. But I would say also many examples in Surkhandara, including the chain of fortresses that were built by the ancient Greeks. Some of the important sites in the Fergana Valley. So Aksakent, the birthplace of the Emperor Babur, is a hugely important historical site which deserves to have much more attention and going forward management. And some of the archaeological sites which are still being excavated. It seems that every few months a new ancient city is discovered in Uzbekistan by the archaeologists, and that kind of research and the protection of what they find also requires investment.
Yes. Looking forward, in the next 10 years, what would you love to see improved in Uzbekistan, especially when it comes to tourism?
What I would like to see actually is much more of an overlap of environmental protection and tourism, because in the last few years, the focus in Uzbekistan has been always on more tourism, on increasing the number of arrivals. And although I understand that, I think it is a better metric to focus on the value that the tourists bring. So rather than saying 10 million tourists or 20 million tourists, say we want to have an average tourism spend of $1,000 or $2,000, because what we want is the economic benefit that the tourists bring and the jobs that they can create. And if we think about it in terms of the financial value, we can also factor in the environmental impact, because every time somebody gets on an airplane, whether they're flying to Uzbekistan, whether they're flying domestically, when they check into a hotel, the buses and the cars that they're driving in, there is going to be a carbon and environmental imprint as well. And we need to make sure that the economic impact is greater than the environmental damage that has been done, and that some of the economic value is then reinvested in mitigating the environmental damage and ideally regenerating some of the challenges that we have. And ecotourism is a very good way of doing that. And I was very glad to see at the Eco Expo in Samarkand this week, there was a lot of focus on nature-based tourism. So every region of Uzbekistan had its own stand. So there was a stand for Sirdarya, for Navoy, for Bukhara, and so on and so forth. And a lot of them were showcasing their reforestation and afforestation projects. I was glad to see Bukhara had a whole display on its plans for building more gardens and parks and arboretums. In Sirdarya, they were telling me about the breeding programs they have got for the Zarafshan pheasant. And there are similar breeding programs for the Bukhara deer in Karakal, Pakistan and other parts of the country. So if we can link conservation and tourism together, some of the revenues that come from the tourism can then be used for environmental protection, for breeding programs, for expanding national parks and protected areas, for funding research, and for funding the management of those spaces, because it's very important that organisations, for example, from the Academy of Science or the rangers and wildlife researchers who work under the Committee for Ecology have got a sustainable income for their projects, because those are going to have a very long-term impact, not only for the wildlife, but also for the people who share the environment with the species that people want to come and see.
I see. Regarding that, in general, like per se, does tourism protect, like, is it actually possible that tourism protects nature, or it's actually inevitable that there is some environmental pressure when it comes to tourism?
Tourism always has an environmental pressure on nature, but the benefits can, if properly managed, outweigh the damage. And there are around the world a number of very good examples of countries or local tourism departments where they have decided to put nature first, and they have designed and managed the tourism in such a way that I would say it is a net positive rather than damage. Two countries which have done it very well. One is Botswana in Africa, which is a very high-end safari destination, and they have ensured that the protected areas are generally under community ownership. They restrict big developments. They make sure, for example, that a lot of the camps can only be temporary. You cannot build a big hotel in a national park. You can build a glamping site, but it has to be off-grid. And it has to be movable. So you should, at the end of the season, be able to take it away and it would look as if nothing was there. And so by engaging the local community and putting nature first, they have created a very high quality product which serves the local community and the environment. Another country which has done very well, yes, with its nature tourism, but also with its cultural tourism, is Bhutan in the Himalayas. And I am always fascinated by Bhutan because rather than charting the growth and the success of the country in GDP, gross domestic product, they have what they call GNH, gross national happiness.
Wow.
So they have set a different set of criteria for what it means to be successful. It is not always more money. It can also be things like the level of education, life expectancy, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And so by not always chasing the financial successes, they are able to ensure a higher quality of living for their population and protection of the natural world as well. And tourists want to see that, they want to learn from that. Bhutan set, until very recently, a minimum spend. So you could not come in as a backpacker and just spend no money or spend very little money. Your visa included a minimum daily amount that would have to be spent on your accommodation, your guiding and so forth. And what that meant is that all of the tourists were spending a lot of money and that money stayed in Bhutan. It wasn't going to foreign companies.
I see. So actually there are countries which successfully balanced this environmental protection and tourism.
Yes, and there is a lot that Uzbekistan can learn from them.
Yeah. What do you think are the main aspects which Uzbekistan can learn from these two examples, or maybe some other countries as well who are not maybe as successful, however they are also doing some great effort, to balance these two things?
The first thing that Uzbekistan should do, I think, is to focus on the value that tourism brings, not on the number of tourists, because this will help us move away from a mass market model where there are lots of tourists come but they don't spend very much money, to tourists who are spending more and that money is being retained in the local community. And there are a number of companies and organisations now who are starting to track that data and to be able to use AI models to be able to analyse exactly how much remains in the local community. One of them is a company called Much Better Adventures, but there are also companies like Intrepid and G-Adventures who are doing their own calculations to see exactly what the economic impact of their tours is. So that would be my first thing, to be focusing on economic impact, not the number of tourists. The second thing is to take very seriously the strategy and management plans for protected areas. So at the moment there are some general protections for Uzbekistan's national parks and reserves, but the same protections are not always afforded to the urban areas. So we need to think about all of our tourism areas in terms of the relationship between people and the economy, people and culture and society, because that is something which is vulnerable also if there is a lot of tourism, and the environment. So three pillars together: economy, society and environment. And if we can think about all of these three things at the same time and put in place good management plans and enforce those management plans, because sometimes we have got good documents on paper, but in practice they are not realised. But if we can implement them in a way which engages the local community or the stakeholders and is fairly administered, I think that would be a good step forward.
Great. You've recently became a ecology ambassador at the national level. So what has surprised you since entering the field? Like, surely you were involved in this field even before. However, now as you have an opportunity to get really detailed when it comes to research and so on, please tell me, what are the things which surprised you?
You're right, I've been involved in ecology and environment for a long time because a lot of my academic research is about water and water security, and particularly on the Amudarya, which is a vital source of life for almost everybody in Central Asia. So the ability to work more closely with the government on, yes, water, but related environmental and climate issues in Uzbekistan is very, very important for me. The first thing that I have noticed is how much more seriously the government is taking these issues than a few years ago. I would say probably 5 years ago it was a second tier or third tier priority, but now having the Committee for Ecology and Climate Change immediately under the President says that Uzbekistan is taking notice. And not only that it is taking notice domestically, but, and this is something which we have been talking about this week at the Jeff Assembly and at the Eco Expo, Uzbekistan is now ready to take an international role in environmental diplomacy and coordination. So it is not just thinking about itself, it is thinking about how it interacts with other countries, how they can share expertise, how they can share financing, technologies, and have a collaborative approach to developing solutions for improving the environmental and climatic issues.
I see. Talking about the environmental challenges in the region and also your research, especially when it comes to the water resources and Amudarya in particular, do you think the transnational or transborder rivers is one of the most acute issues when it comes to environment in our region, or there are some other more important things which we have to face in the upcoming years?
I would say that water as a whole is the most acute issue facing Central Asia. Both the availability of water, availability in the right place, because although we have some places with drought, also we have some places with flooding, and then the quality of that water, because when water becomes contaminated, whether it's through too much salt, too much pesticides, or industrial, or even residential contamination, that water is then no longer safe for drinking and no longer safe for farming. So the water is going to affect every aspect of life. It is going to affect where people can live. It's going to affect where people can farm. It's going to affect where wildlife can survive. So that is probably, for me, the number one issue we have to address. However, there are many other issues, some of which are related, which we have to take very seriously. I know in Tashkent last year there was a very big problem with air pollution.
Yep.
And that is something that in places with high population density and more cars and people wanting more and more technology, we're going to have to look at very carefully. Similarly, because the population is growing and because the standard of living is growing, the amount of energy consumption is going up very, very fast as well. So we need to think about where that energy is going to come from. And it does seem to be that there is, although Uzbekistan still has a lot of gas, there is a move away from the fossil fuels into new technologies. And I was talking to Uzhydromet at the Eco Expo, and they are doing now a lot of manufacturing for turbines, for hydroelectric power, both for the big dams, but also for small micro hydro units, which can be put in irrigation canals to generate power for the local area. I know there is a lot of solar power construction happening, and also wind power. So there are many forms of renewable technologies which Uzbekistan is investing in and scaling up across the country. And that is good for a variety of reasons. One being that it means we can bring power to local communities, and they are not all dependent on being part of the same main grid. Whenever you transmit power over a long distance, you are losing it the further you go from the power source. And so if we can have, for example, at a factory level or at a village level, your own power generation through solar or through wind turbines, that means less of the power is wasted.
I see. Now, in the bigger picture, let's say in around 20 years, what is one thing which is related to environment overall, which Uzbekistan can do, which will impact in a positive way, surely, the situation which we have? Like, what's the input which should be done in order to have some incremental, some very positive response?
In my opinion, one of the biggest things is to reform the agricultural sector, because Uzbekistan at the moment has got one of the world's least water efficient agricultural sectors.
Wow.
So what that means is the volume of water which is required for every $1 of agricultural output is higher than almost anywhere in the world. And that has to come down. And there are different ways that we can do that. One is by upgrading, modernizing the irrigation system, because the system of canals that we have at the moment, and particularly old canals which leak and lose a lot of water to evaporation, means a lot of the water which goes into the system never gets to the field. So we need to make sure that the distribution for the water is more effective. We're also still using a Soviet-style system of flooding a lot of the fields to wash the salt out, which again uses a lot more water than would be required. So already I'm seeing the introduction of things like drip irrigation, and use of water sensors to ensure that the water is much more targeted. So those things are very effective. At the same time, the sorts of crops that we grow are going to be changed. So historically, of course, Uzbekistan has grown a lot of cotton, but there are also many other water-intensive crops which are grown here, like rice. And I would expect that in the next few years, because water is going to become more and more scarce, Uzbekistan will have to change the combination of crops that it is growing. So it might be, for example, that we reduce the amount of rice which is grown in Uzbekistan and import that from somewhere else, but we are producing more soft fruits or grains or whatever product, and particularly drought-resistant strains of those products. And so Uzbekistan will reduce production in some things and increase in others, and then have hopefully a trade balance. So we would be importing rice but exporting fruits or whatever, making sure that the plants we are growing are those which are most appropriate for the environmental conditions that we have.
I see. Unfortunately, we are limited with time, so we'll have a couple of questions before we wrap this up. Previously, I wanted to ask about the Center of Islamic Civilization. Actually, especially recently, since its opening, it's gained significant attention, worldwide attention, I would say.
Yeah.
Also becoming part of the World Guinness Book for certain things. But what I wanted to ask is, despite shaping mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, so many of Central Asia's greatest minds, maybe due to kind of Eurocentrism in certain aspects, especially when it comes to scientific academia, they remain absent from the mainstream, from the global narratives. Or actually, even if there are some names, but they are actually presented, they're presented as maybe of Greek or Latin origin, and actually their identities are concealed in some way. So, and one of the main important things is that their identity as the Central Asian Muslim scholars are actually concealed. So, do you think that initiative such as this, such as the Center of Islamic Civilization, can actually help rediscover the region's intellectual legacy?
I think it has some potential for that. I went to the museum in March, and it is a very impressive museum with a huge range of exhibits. For me, what was interesting is it really is a museum of the history of Uzbekistan and the culture of Uzbekistan. The Islamic scholars and the Islamic identity is obviously very prominent in the museum's name, but in the museum itself, we go right back to the prehistory of Uzbekistan. Yes. And the foundational religions which were here before, the Buddhism, the Zoroastrianism that we were talking about earlier. And the museum goes all the way through to the present day and the modern industries and technologies and politics of Uzbekistan. So in some ways, I think of it as a national museum. Yes. And a national centre rather than an Islamic civilization centre. To me, if you say Islamic civilization, that is not just Uzbekistan, that is a number of Islamic civilizations. So many other countries. So there is an identity question with the museum. But certainly there will be a lot of people, a lot of foreigners who will visit that museum and will be learning for the first time about the golden age of Islam, about people like Al-Khwarizmi, Imam al-Bukhari, Ibn Sina, and so on and so forth. So certainly they will be learning about those. What we have to remember, though, is that internationally, the general public are probably never going to be coming to Uzbekistan, and they're not going to be interested in Islamic medieval scholars. This is not a reflection on Uzbekistan or the history. They are also not interested in medieval scholars from Europe or from China. Yes. Or from anywhere else. So the people who are going to be interested and wanting to learn are people who have either already got an academic interest. So, for example, if somebody is interested in mathematics or computer sciences, they probably have already heard of Al-Khwarizmi, or at least of the concepts that he developed, and they will want to learn more. Same with the sorts of people who have chosen to come to Uzbekistan. Probably they are already people who are interested in culture and history, and so when they come to the Center of Islamic Civilization, they will want to learn more about the subjects they are already interested in. That is quite different from a shopkeeper in Bradford, or a primary school teacher in Paris, or a footballer from Spain, because it is not part of their sphere of interest, not part of their academic work necessarily. And so for them, it is probably not going to make a difference. But for the sort of people who are interested and do want to learn more, it's a good resource for them to learn from.
Great. Now we have some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
There are no right or wrong answers. So, planned itinerary or spontaneous adventure?
For me, spontaneous adventure.
Great. Samarkand, Bukhara or Khiva?
Bukhara. Great. And I'm going to get very unpopular for that. Everybody in Samarkand and Khiva will be throwing stones now.
Yes. So, Silk Road caravanserai or medieval European castle?
Silk Road caravanserai.
1 week in Paris or 1 month exploring Central Asia?
1 month in Central Asia.
So, Swiss Alps or the landscapes of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan?
Oh, that's difficult because I like both. I would say landscapes of Kyrgyzstan because I think Kyrgyzstan is more beautiful than Kazakhstan.
Okay. Next up is Scottish Highlands or Tajikistan's Pamirs?
I would say Scottish Highlands because I have spent a lot of time working in Tajikistan and particularly in the Pamir, and I have never been to the Scottish Highlands. So I would like to go there for the first time.
Great, great. Now, the London Underground or Tashkent Metro?
Tashkent Metro, every time. It is cleaner, it is cheaper, and it is much more beautiful.
Venice at sunrise or Bukhara at sunset?
Bukhara at sunset.
Cafe Italiano, American coffee, or Uzbek black tea with lemon and navat?
Uzbek black tea, every time. I am a tea drinker, not a coffee drinker.
Great. And the final question, World Cup 2026, England or Uzbekistan?
Uzbekistan, definitely. I will be cheering for Uzbekistan.
Great. And to wrap this up, what would be your advice, since you know our audience are mostly youngsters, and also Uzbekistan is one of the youngest countries in the world, considering that 1/4 of the overall population are people from 18 up to 34 years old. So what would be your advice to those actually who would like to do an impact not only locally in their communities, but also globally with time?
I think to find something you are passionate about, because if you are going to have an impact, you have to work at it for an extended period. You are not going to have an impact by doing something for 2 weeks. It is going to be something that you have to work hard to develop your skills, develop your experience, develop your network over many years. And if it is not something you are passionate about, you will lose interest. So the important thing is to find something that you really believe is important, and then you can put all of your energy and time to working towards it.
Thank you so much. That was a great discussion.
Well, thank you for having me. I've thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.